Okay, hi there. In this third little talk on Plato's Symposium, I'd like to discuss Socrates' great speech, and then the dialogue ends with a certain Alcibiades coming in, crashing the party, and he gives a speech. So that's the last two moments of the dialogue. So right before Socrates' speech, you have Agathon's speech. And as you know, it's at Agathon's home where the party is taking place. Agathon gives this incredibly rhapsodic speech, very poetic, and he um, speaks about the great beauty of Eros and the great um, goodness of Eros and how Eros is the king of the gods and so on. I think what Plato wants to show here is how everyone is caught up in the magic of Agathon's speech and the fine soundingness of the speech, the poetic quality of the speech. And now it's Socrates' turn to speak. And right before Socrates' speech, Agathon finishes and everyone is spellbound. They're caught up in the magic of his rhetoric, of his great panegyric, his great praise, song and praise of Eros. Well, when Socrates begins his speech, he starts with a particular ironic comment. Now, the irony of Socrates is something you don't want to pass by because irony is when you say something and you mean something else, right? It's sort of borderlines on sarcasm. So what Plato does there when he has Socrates get ready to give his speech right after Agathon, he claims, there's no way I can compete against that. There's a kind of contest going on through the whole thing. You see, the Greek people, I think I mentioned this in passing, the Greek people were agonistic people. That means they were fond of the contest. That's why they developed the Olympic Games and they have contests about everything. And it's my observation, it's pretty obvious, I think, that this is what we have inherited from the ancient Greeks. The contests are important when they're healthy. There's a good contest and a bad contest. The good contest is when the contestants bring out the best in each other. The bad contest is when they try to annihilate each other, like in war or ruthless business tactics like monopolies and so on. But there can be a good contest, like the Olympic Games, or so that sense of the contest is sort of permeating all of the speeches. They're all trying to give the best speech and be the the one who gives the best speech. Well, Socrates responds to that tacit sense of contest in saying, I think he refers to Eryximachus, the son of Acumenos. He says the Greeks didn't have last names; they would say son or daughter of so and so. So he turns to Eryximachus. Wasn't I right, son of Acumenos? He's speaking to Eryximachus. That there's no way I can compete against such speeches. Listen to that speech. It was awesome. But then he goes on to say, but I thought what we were supposed to do was to speak the truth. Now, this is very important for Plato because philosophy is the love of wisdom, and wisdom is knowledge of the truth. So the philosopher is in love with truth, okay? And so what Socrates does there in his ironic comment is when he says, I thought what we were supposed to do is speak the truth about Eros, but now I realize what you're all doing is conjuring up all the most sublime images and concepts and then projecting it onto this God, onto this human sentiment, um, Eros, and then projecting it and saying that that's Eros. If that's what you want me to do, I can't do it. I can only speak in plain language and I can only speak the truth. You see, that wasn't by accident that Plato put that there, right? So now he sets Socrates aside from all the other speeches. But even more importantly than that ironical comment at the beginning. So, but first, let's make sure we don't pass by the main point. The main point, what Plato is saying there, is that Socrates is going to do his best to speak the truth about Eros, because for Plato, what philosophy is doing essentially is taking words, key words, not just any word, like eros, like piety, like courage, like truth, justice, wisdom, being, non being. These are ultimate issues. And we use these words all the time. But the main point is, what does the word refer to? What we want to do is find out the truth that the word refers to, so that when we say the word truth or justice, there's an accompanying concept that corresponds to that word, so that when we use words, these words refer to the truth. I don't know if you've noticed that how people can use words all different ways. It matters who is speaking and what that person has in mind when they use that word. Like if you say to somebody, do you believe in God? They say, yes, I believe in God. Well, that doesn't tell you too much. It tells you something. It tells you they have faith. It tells you they believe in God. But the next question is, well, what is God for you? What is your concept of God? And you'll find all kinds of responses to that question. Some are very shallow, some are deep, some are this way, some are that way. Okay, so it has to do with finding the reality that corresponds to key words. So in this case, the key word is eros. And so that's why Plato has Socrates express that ironic observation there and that announcement that he's only going to try to speak in plain language the truth. Also in the background, since I know Plato pretty well, one the greatest threat, if what I'm saying is true about language, then the greatest threat to truth and to the search, the love of truth, to philosophy, is sophistical rhetoric. Now, there were these men in ancient Greece, they were called sophists, which means wise man. And they didn't believe in truth. They thought everything was relative. Everyone has their own opinion. Every opinion is of equal worth. There is no truth. It's a little bit like what's happening in our world today. They're speaking now of a post-truth era that we live in, you know, which is outrageous, right? I mean, if there's no truth, then there's no lies, then anything goes, right? So the greatest threat to philosophy, if philosophy is the love of truth, is this sophistical rhetoric where what matters is persuasion only. And there is no truth, these sophists believe. If there is no truth, then what matters is learn how to speak in such a way that you can persuade people to see things your way. Then you have power over them. So it leads to the idea that might makes right. This is an important moral observation. If might makes right, then morality goes down the tubes, right? Then whoever has, like, if I have a gun and I have it at your head, then I'm right and you're wrong. Well, no, that means I have power over you. I'm going to make you do what I want up to a point. Depends on your integrity, but that doesn't mean I'm right. If that were the case, then Christ is wrong, and the Jews and the Romans who crucified him were right. You know, it can't be that might makes right in the true sense of the word right. So this sophistical rhetoric leads to that idea that might makes right. Whoever has power is right. That doesn't mean power is a bad thing either. I mean, life is power. Life wants power. But exploitive power, power that puts others down in order to put themselves up, that's a bad kind of power. So there is such a thing as right and wrong outside of who has the power. So all this is going on in the back. I mean, it's not being said there in that ironical comment by Socrates, you know, that I thought, But in the background is what Plato's doing is showing how Socrates engages in Socratic rhetoric, the true art of rhetoric, where truth matters, whereas the other speakers, not all of them, but to a greater or lesser extent, are speaking in such a way that they just want to impress and persuade. So it has to do with what takes preeminence, persuasion or truth. In sophistical rhetoric, persuasion takes preeminence over truth. And with sophistical rhetoric, there is no truth. There is no right and wrong either when it comes to morality. It's just whoever has the power. But in the true art of rhetoric, where Plato wants to set up Socrates as the originator and spokesman of the true art of rhetoric, then truth takes preeminence over persuasion. Persuasion is important. He doesn't rule it out. It's just it has to come second to truth. So there's a difference between true and false. There's a difference between right and wrong. So all that is going on behind the scenes with Socrates' ironical comment. But perhaps even more obvious is how Socrates starts his speech. Notice, he doesn't give a speech at the beginning when it's his turn. What does he do? He questions Agathon. So there's a few pages in the dialogue where instead of giving a speech, he questions Agathon, who just spoke right before him. So this is a radical difference in the way Socrates begins. Now, again, if Plato were here and we were to ask him, well, why did you have Socrates engage in dialectic, philosophical conversation with Agathon instead of just giving a speech like everyone else? Well, I think Plato would say, given my knowledge of the dialogues, that in order to live the good life, one needs to live philosophically. What does it mean to live philosophically? Well, part of the answer is to engage in dialectics. Dia means through in Greek. Lectic is from the infinitive legein, which means to gather, to say, and to place forth. So if you put all those elements together, dialectic, it means through questioning, through philosophical conversation, there's the through part, the dia, and there's something that comes forth from concealment into unconcealment, from lithia to alethea. And what comes forth is a gathering. And what is that gathering? It's an idea. It's a concept. And it's the truth that corresponds to the word. So through saying, something comes forth from concealment to unconcealment. What comes forth is a gathering. In what sense is it a gathering? A concept is a gathering of all that is common among all the different empirical manifestations of something. Like if I say the word snow refers to all the different kinds of snows, all what they all have in common. As you probably observed, especially if you live around these parts. Snow is different every day. And even in one day, the snow may change. And no two snowflakes are the same, people say. But there is this concept snow, this word snow. So what is snow? It's what is common among all the different manifestations of this stuff we call snow, which is different in every manifestation. But with philosophy, instead of dealing with words like snow and silver and whatever, we're talking about ultimate issues like eros in this case, or truth. So dialectic is philosophical conversation. It's the directing force to the good life for Plato. It has to do with the intellect, raising an ultimate question, engaging in dialogue with yourself, like Socrates was doing right before he came to the party, or now as he engages Agathon. And in all the dialogues, Socrates is engaging in dialectic. And Plato wants to really put that in the forefront of his philosophy. He's saying if you want to live the good life, you must raise these ultimate questions, admit to yourself that you don't know, and be open and engage in philosophical conversation, either with others or with yourself. And it's best with others, but you can do it by yourself also. It's an inner dialogue. But it's better with others, as I said last time, because you have the freedom of the other to criticize what you're saying. So he's putting that at the forefront of the philosophical life of what he calls the good life. Engage in dialogue. So he engages, agathon. And the dialectic is different every time, but the structure is the same always. So, for example, what's the same about dialectic? It's always an ultimate question that's raised. It's always something that pertains to that matters. It pertains to our existence. And it's always with other people, with yourself. So, and it's always raising this question: what is the essence? What is the being of such and such, whatever it is? So he engages agathon, and in that dialogue with agathon, he lays the foundations for his speech. So, what is that dialogue all about? Well, he asks Agathon, uh, is love, can there be love or eros without the love of something or other? No, Socrates. There has to be love of something or other. Um, so now he's established the fact that love is always love of something. And he uses analogies. Can you be a brother another, without a sister or without another brother? It's impossible. The word brother is relational, and some things are just relational. I can't be a brother unless I have a sister or another brother. Okay, so that word brother holds within itself a relation. In the same way with eros, there can't be just love. It has to be love of something or other. So now love is always love of something. It always has to have an object that it's engaged, that it's love of. Okay. And then what is it that love intends towards? Well, he gets Agathon to say it's love, it's beauty. You said to Agathon that love is the most beautiful thing. But if it has beauty already, then it can't desire beauty. So now everything is changing, right? Now love is love of something or other, and that something or other is always going to be beauty. And then he connects the good and the beautiful. Whatever is beautiful is good. Whatever is good is beautiful. So love is always love of the good. Okay. And then he also establishes through that dialogue that love lacks beauty and it lacks the good. Okay, so love is always intentional, it always has an object, and that object is precisely what it lacks and it wants to fulfill. Like when we're thirsty and we lack water, or we're hungry, we lack food. So it's an orexis, a hunger that lacks. Orexis means hunger in Greek. It's like anorexia means, the lack of hunger. So orexia is hunger. So love is a hunger, it lacks, and what it hungers for is beauty and the good. Okay, so he establishes that. Now it sounds very obvious, but none of the other speeches made that observation. And notice how that truth came to be. It came to be through, there's dia, through what? Through saying, through asking a question, Agathon answering, Socrates examining the answer. Through saying, something comes forth. What came forth? Some truth about Eros. That Eros is intentional, that it's a lack, that it always lacks beauty, and it lacks the good, and it wants the good. It's a desire for the good. So notice, something came forth from concealment into unconcealment. And that word concealment, lethia, Lethia in Greek, means concealment. Then means un. So aletheia means unconcealment. Now that's the word for truth in ancient Greek. Okay? Aletheia is that's where we have words like Alice, Alyssa, and Allison, those names. They all come from whenever I meet somebody who is named Alice, I like to tell her that, you know, that's your name. Your name means unconcealment. So that's the word for truth in Greek. It's an event. Unconcealment means an event from concealment into unconcealment. So truth happens. It's a verb, and it happens through philosophical conversation. That's why it's so important to admit to yourself that you don't have all the answers to all these ultimate issues, and then humbly engage. Oh, it doesn't have to be humbly, but you can do it with confidence too. But the main thing is to admit to yourself. Actually, it takes a little more confidence to admit that you don't know, if you think about it. I mean, people who claim to know when they don't know, upon examination, probably have less confidence than people who can have the uh, wherewithal, the largesse of soul to admit that they don't know. Okay, so that's the big thing about his questioning Agathon is those points that I just made about Eros. The next thing that happens in the dialogue is Socrates mentions a particular woman from Mantinea. Her name was Diotima, or Diotima probably was the Greek pronunciation. The D sometimes has a TH sound in Greek, but we say Diotima. And she was a priestess, and he claims that when he was a young man, and that she initiated him into the mysteries of Eros, or taught him the main points of the art of love, of erotica. So, and then he also tells everyone there that the same questions that I was just asking you, Agathon, because I thought when I was a young man that Eros was beautiful and it was good and it was the king of the gods and so on. But after meeting Diotima and listening to her questioning, engaging in dialogue with Diotima, I came to these other ideas that I just had you admit. So he rehashes those same questions. In other words, he claims that those same questions that I asked you, Agathon, those are the questions that Diotima asked me. And we came to those same conclusions, that love is intentional, that it's a lack, that it lacks beauty, and it lacks the good. And it's a hunger. It wants that. Then we come to Socrates' speech. But he delivers his speech by recounting the dialogue. Now we're still in dialogue. Notice Plato's obsessed with dialogue. I don't know if you've noticed this, but first of all, he wrote dialogues, right? And in the dialogue, we have Apollodorus responding to this unnamed friend. So that's a dialogue within this dialogue. And then, we hear Socrates now rehashing this dialogue that took place when he was a young man, and he's presenting it now in the form of a speech at the home of Agathon. So we have dialogues within dialogues, So Socrates' speech, and the other thing I think Plato wants us to see is how far this speech outstrips all the others. It's like it eclipses the others. It's so great. It's much greater than all the other speeches. The other thing I think he wants you to see is that these others, and I've been talking about this throughout, these other earlier speeches have grains of truth, but they're but they find their place in Socrates, especially Aristophanes' speech about love is the desire to become whole. That's really strong in Socrates' speech. But elements too. There's a noble and ignoble love, and that's in Socrates' speech too. But he takes elements of these early speeches, but changes them and recasts them and puts it together in a new form, where you have a completely new speech. So, what are they? So he gives his speech in the form of recounting a dialogue that took place between himself and Diotima when he was a young man. And these are some of the most lofty ideas about Eros that I've come across in my thinking. By the way, as an aside, you probably should know there's all kinds of love. There's as many kinds of love as there are people. Okay, people love. But basically, in philosophy, we speak of three different kinds of love. There's eros, which is usually associated with erotic desires, with attraction and sexual attraction, the desire to procreate and beauty. And then there's philia, which it's an ancient Greek word, and it means like friendship. It's broader than our concept friendship. It includes what we mean by friendship, but it includes any bond that holds any group together. The notion of philia comes across really strong in Eryximachus' speech when he speaks about love being this cosmic force of harmony. But then with Christianity, we have agape, the love of God, and the love of God that reflects itself in our love of each other. So these are the three. Now, the reason I mention that is that Plato had at his disposal the word philia, and that's the word his great student Aristotle will use in speaking about friendship and speaking deeply about the importance of friendship in the good life, as you'll see when we move to Aristotle. But Plato deliberately chose, and he knew about the word philia, of course. He's the great man of letters, and he's Plato, so he knew about philia for sure. But he used eros instead. He deliberately went to that word eros, but he wants to give it new meaning. So the big idea that comes in Socrates' speech when he's recounting what Diotima told him, it's Socrates' speech, but he's telling everyone there at the party what he had learned from Diotima. And by the way, as I said last time, this is the only thing he ever claims to have knowledge of, is erotic matters. So what are the main points of that speech? Well, everything we've learned from Socrates questioning Agathon, and then when Socrates tells about how when he was a young man, Diotima questioned him, the foundation of the speech is that love is intentional, that it's always intending towards something, it has an object, and that object is always beauty and the good, and that it desires that. But now he builds on that. So it's not just the desire for it, but the perpetual possession of that. So if you desire something and you already have it, if somebody desires money, for example, and they have a lot of money, what they really desire is the perpetual possession of wealth. So Socrates is saying it's not just the love is not just the love of beauty and the love of the good, but it's the perpetual possession, to continue to possess beauty. And if you think about the perpetual possession of the good and the beautiful, there's still a lack there because the future's not yet. And so you can still desire something you don't have, even if you have it. I know this sounds weird, but like if I have a lot of money and I desire money, then what does that mean? How can I desire something I already have? Well, what you desire, let's leave out the more money part because the most greedy people just want even more money. But what you want is the perpetual possession of that good, right? So the perpetual possession of that is still lacking. So it's still a lack. So we end up with love is the desire for the perpetual possession of beauty. And how do we perpetually possess something? Through procreation. So love then becomes the desire to procreate in beauty. Okay? The desire to procreate in beauty. And then Socrates goes on to tell everyone there at the party more about what he learned about Eros from Diotima. Diotima tells him, you know, Socrates, all things come to be out of sexual union. So this drive is the source of life. And everything really desires immortality. All humans desire to become immortal. But there's different kinds of procreation. Now, here's where everything changes. In Plato's philosophy, you're always going to find an ascent. Every dialogue has it. In some of the major dialogues, it's stage by stage. So he's going to take Eros. It's always going. There's going to be a structure that remains the same. It's always going to be desire to procreate in beauty, the desire to procreate in the good. It's always going to be a hunger. It's always going to be beauty. It's always going to be the good. It's always going to be the desire for procreation, and ultimately the desire for immortality. That will remain constant. But that constancy is going to go through a metamorphosis. It's going to go through a change. So Eros is always going to be Eros, but there are different forms of it, different uh, like stages that it goes through. Okay, so there's something that remains the same, and yet it's going to go through metamorphosis, transformation, ascent, upward. So he makes a distinction, which you find in some of the early dialogues, like in Pausanias' speech, in Phaedrus's speech too, about the difference between heavenly Eros or heavenly Aphrodite. After a while, they start. Aphrodite is a female version of Eros in Greek mythology. Aphrodite is the goddess of beauty and love. So they speak like interchangeably using Aphrodite, Eros. But Socrates is not so much speaking of the god. In fact, that's something I just left out. The other thing that Socrates teaches everyone that's very important is that love is not a god. Okay, that's big for the Greeks. Okay, it's not a god. So if it's not a god, then what is it? Is it mortal? No. So Diotima teaches Socrates, just like Socrates taught Agathon, don't think that if something is not divine, that it's mortal. He wants to get he wants to show that there's a continuum sometimes. Sometimes things are not just black and white. In between up and down, there are all these in betweens, right? So between the divine and the mortal, there's the demonic. Okay, that has nothing to do with demons. This is before Christianity. So demons came into the world with Christianity. The demonic just means a great spirit, something that bridges the gap between the divine and the human. So that's an important point, that love bridges the gap between divinity and human. If there's a way for humans to make contact with divinity, it's going to be through Eros. Okay, so Eros is a great spirit. And Eros is going to be the driving force of dialectic. Okay, so let's put these pieces together. Moral philosophy for Plato has to do with living philosophically. There's more to his moral philosophy than that, but this is one way of approaching it. Living philosophically means to engage in dialectic. Dialectic is the directing force of the good life. Okay, but what's driving that force? Like if we were to use analogy from like sailboats, the rudder of the sailboat would be like dialectic. It's going to steer the boat. But without the wind filling the sails, the boat's not going anywhere. So what is the wind? What is the driving force that drives one to the good life for Plato? It's going to be eros. But it's going to be eros sublimated. Now, I use that word. Plato never used the word sublimation. Sublimation is a word that came into our vocabulary pretty much by Sigmund Freud. And I'm sure that he got it from Plato. He even uses the word eros as one of the main driving forces of human nature, of the human unconscious. But sublimation is taking that erotic drive, that raw sexual attraction, that desire to procreate in beauty, and to spiritualize it, to go through stages. Okay? So Plato has Socrates telling everyone what he learned from Diotima when he was a young man. And he's telling everyone that Diotima told him that all living creatures desire immortality. And on the human level, there are two kinds of procreation. There's physical procreation, which anybody can do. I mean, you don't have to be Albert Einstein or, Beethoven to have sex with someone, right? So physical procreation is just when two people come together, or two animals, or even plants, and out of sexual union, then babies are born. And so that's how common people participate in immortality. Like if I have a child, I look at that child and I see traits of myself in the child. And then they have children, and I look at my grandchildren and I see traits of myself in that grandchild as I get old. And I even have great grandchildren, which is kind of cool. So I see my great grandchildren and I see myself in them to a certain degree. I mean, physically, some of the DNA may be the same or similar. So that's how common people participate in immortality, by having children, procreation. And eros is the driving force of procreation. Think you see someone who's attractive and you desire them, you come together, and eventually we procreate, and there's children are born. But then there's spiritual procreation. Now, not just anybody can do that. Not just anyone can make Beethoven's symphonies or generate the special theory of relativity that Einstein did, right? It takes a little bit of development of capacities to be able to produce something like that. And that's how noble love works in driving someone to become earthly immortal. There's different kinds of immortality. Now, Plato is well aware of the theories of immortality. If you were to take your time to read Plato's dialogues, especially the Phaedo, it's the scene where Socrates is in prison, and that morning he has to drink hemlock and he's going to have to be executed. And it's a long dialogue. And in that dialogue, many of the theories of the immortality of the soul are already there that are used by Christian theology. Christian theology was very much influenced by Plato, especially St. Augustine and many other great theologians. And many of the theories of the immortality of the soul are already in Plato's dialogues, especially in that one I just mentioned, the Phaedo, but in other ones as well. But that's not what he's talking about here. He's talking about a different kind of immortality, earthly immortality. And now there's no speculation. about what happens after you die. It's about producing something so great that when you die, it still lives. Like Plato's dialogues. Here we are. Here I am talking about it. Here you are listening to me. To a certain extent, Plato's living because he's living through his dialogues. Those are his children. Einstein's theory of relativity, that's his child. Beethoven's symphonies, and there's so many wonderful examples of progeny, of great people who have lived on. Our Constitution, for example, which is under threat, these days, uh, and so fragile. Sometimes these earthly children are fragile too. They're not. They can die too. I mean, um, at any rate, let's not get too carried away with this. This is called earthly immortality. Okay, so love is always the desire for immortality, but there's different kinds of immortality. There's spiritual procreation and physical procreation. Common people procreate physically, but it's only the rare ones who've developed some capacities by allowing eros to be their guide and dialectic to be the directing force. Then they develop capacities. And one day those capacities all come together and they produce something, their progeny, and they live on after they die. Okay, that's called earthly immortality. It's a whole different, I think it's a whole different kind of immortality. It's not speculation about the immortality of the soul or faith in the immortality of the soul, but rather creating something that lives on after you die. The other thing that's important about Socrates' speech are these stages. Now, I don't know how literal to take each stage. I think what's important is that there are stages and that there is this process of sublimation, of the spiritualization of our erotic drives that takes place in anyone who's living the good life. But he gives pretty definite steps. They're almost like this is step one, this is step two. And Socrates shares that with everyone there. So it starts off one person is attracted to another person, and there's this desire to procreate, and they feel like they found the love of their life. That's usually where most people, that's where their erotic drives begin, and that's where they end. And it's a great thing. Songs are written about it. I mean, romantic love. That's um, actually we're at a place in history that came before romantic love. I think romantic love came in the Middle Ages with the troubadours singing of courtly love, and then we sort of inherited that. But so let's not use the word romantic love. I got ahead of myself there. Um, Properly so called, I think romantic love starts in the Middle Ages. We have inherited that from Middle Ages. But back to the Greeks, erotic drives where one person is attracted to another person. And he mentions a man, an older man being attracted to a younger man, or two men, two women. It doesn't matter if that's another thing about Socrates' speech. Some of the earlier speeches, there was this preeminence of homosexual love between two men being of the highest noble type. And that was a sentiment among the Greeks uh, at the time when Plato wrote. But Plato is putting that all into question. When you read Socrates' speech, there's no real difference. It doesn't matter whether it's homosexual, lesbian, gay, or heterosexual. Um, what matters is the process of sublimation. So you have that at the beginning. Two human beings, either homosexual or heterosexual, doesn't matter, being attracted to each other. Okay. Then there's another stage. Again, I don't know how, I think it's probably more in line with Plato's intention not to make it so specific as this, but let's just go through the stages that he enumerates. The next stage was that love of the soul is seen as, oh no, there's one in between. Between love of the one, there's, you start realizing that beauty is beauty. There's this concept of beauty that starts dawning on it. I mean, you can be in love with someone, but you can look around and see that other people are beautiful too, right? When you get to be my age, everybody's beautiful who's young. I mean, men and women, everybody who's young, it looks good because they're young. Um, so beauty is beauty. And so Socrates says one slackens one's attachment to the one, and one begins to see that there's beauty in this world. Not everyone is beautiful. I was just trying to be funny there a little bit. Not all people are beautiful, obviously. Beauty, the Greek sense of beauty has to do with proportion, and so, but beauty is beauty. So one slackens one's attachment to the one becomes more uh, play the field, as we say today. Realizing that beauty is beauty. So that's the next stage. But then there's the third stage. We're going through the sort of the stages of sublimation or spiritualization of Eros. The third stage he mentions is love of the soul. Now, this is a loaded idea because, see, for the Greeks, beauty was a very important concept, especially the beauty of human body. That's why they created those wonderful sculptures, and so if you were not beautiful, that was a pretty big deal. Now, Socrates was known for not being beautiful. He had a snub nose, and he had bulgy eyes, and he wasn't a handsome man. But when you got to know him, there was this inner beauty, okay? And people would just fall in love with that inner beauty. So that's called the beauty of the soul, beauty of someone's character. He possessed all the moral virtues of courage, temperance, justice, wisdom, okay? Moral excellences, as the Greeks call them, arete. And so beauty of the soul then becomes preeminent above beauty of the body, of all the bodies. Now, he keeps going with this, though. Diotima tells Socrates, this is Socrates telling everyone what Diotima told him. There's the beauty of customs and laws. That sounds so abstract to us, but if you reflect on it, and if you love the human condition, then there's something very beautiful about the customs and the cultures of the various peoples. I mean, just listen to music from Brazil, or listen to music from from India, classical Indian music, or broaden your understanding of culture, and you'll be enamored by all the different variations and the colors of the customs of peoples. He doesn't go into detail like I'm doing now, but he just says it becomes beauty of customs and mores and laws, the beauties of laws. That now usually when we think of Eros, we don't think of being in love, being in love with laws or procreating in the beauty of laws, right? But then he mentions Solon, who Solon, Ohio is named after, by the way. Solon was the first proponent of democracy among the ancient Greeks. And now, democracy is a big issue in the world. Plato himself was not a democratic thinker. He was opposed to democracy. He wasn't opposed to republic, but opposed to democracy. He thought philosophers should rule, not the people. Democracy means the rule of the people. But that he thought the philosophers who are an exception should be the rulers. And if you just give if you give the people especially if the people are not educated in the sense of a liberal arts education, like knowing history and literature and having critical thinking capacities and so on, then you just give them rule and you're going to have chaos. You'll have 70 million people voting for whomever, yeah, because they can't make a distinction between what is right and wrong, what's good and what's not good for the republic. And so it's like giving the kids, rule of the house while you go on a vacation. You come home, you find out what happened to your house. So Plato was very opposed to democracy. But he was talking about, and when he gives examples, he mentions Lycurgus, who made the laws of Sparta, which were famous, and Sparta had a great power at that time. And he mentioned Solon, even though he was opposed to democracy. He mentioned Solon, who was a great political leader. And I just happen to know that Solon was a proponent of democratic government. So that's another stage. And then above that, the beauty of knowledge. See, that's not something we think about. But sometimes if you have a good teacher and they like a math, have you ever had a teacher and they're trying to show you how beautiful? Actually, I believe this way. I don't know if it's coming through in my talks, but philosophy is this incredible discipline. Sometimes I've been doing this all my life, and sometimes I get a little cool about it, and I get interested in other things, music, training my dogs or whatever. And sometimes months will go by where I'm not really engaging, full, with two fists with philosophy. Um, and then I'll read something and it's just, oh my God, this is so great, And so philosophy is a great thing. It's where the mind reaches out as far as it can go, and raising ultimate issues. But all the disciplines, mathematics, there's a beauty of formulae, there's a beauty of knowing history. And so there's a beauty of knowledge. And then to procreate in beauty, that would be to generate knowledge, right? To actually engage in research, not just appropriating it, but procreating it. There's beauty of knowledge. Now, there's another level, wisdom. Wisdom is above knowledge, even. What's the difference between wisdom and knowledge? Wisdom has to do with the whole. Okay, you can learn something and have knowledge, but you don't have insight into the principles upon which the knowledge is based. Okay, so as you move up and your eros is driving you upward, you begin to appreciate the beauty of knowledge, but you're not questioning the principles upon which that knowledge is based. Like, for example, let's just take one discipline, biology, which I happen to like. Biology means the study of life. Bio means life. Okay, so you take a biology class or you major in biology and you learn all kinds of things about life, about cells, about the different systems of living bodies and so on, right? And it's all beautiful and wonderful. But unless you begin to think about life philosophically, you're not questioning the principle upon which that whole discipline is based. If you ask, what is life? Now you've moved out of biology into the philosophy of life. And there are philosophers who are very good about life, on life in their own way. Plato is in his own way, but Nietzsche is great. Bergson is great on life. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. Like they're people, right? And so different people have different strengths. Nietzsche and Bergson come to life, come to mind when I think about philosophers of life. So if you ask, what is life? And you begin to engage in dialogue about life, now you're questioning the very principles upon which biology is based. Same thing with education, same thing with mathematics, with physics, with all the disciplines. If you're questioning the principles upon which they're based, now you're moving out of that discipline into the philosophy of that discipline, like philosophy of education, philosophy of life, philosophy of history, and so on. Now you're moving into wisdom. Wisdom always has to do with the whole. The whole is the flower of wisdom. So, and there's three kinds of wisdoms. There's speculative wisdom, that's called sapientia, Sapientia. That's the Latin word, but in ancient Greek, it's called Sophia, like the girl's name, Sophia, Sophia. Sophia means speculative wisdom. What is speculative wisdom? It's seeing the principles upon which knowledge is based and putting them all together into a vision of the whole. It sounds impossible, but it's not. It's the study of being as being. It's a vision of how all this knowledge you're learning, how it all comes together into one whole. Like the example, like if you study, let's say you study St. Francis in some religion class, and he's talking about how wonderful all life is and how life is really a projection from divinity, and nature is part of God. You can't separate God from nature. If God is omnipresent, then he must be present in nature too, right? So, okay, and so you're studying St. Francis and his love of nature. Well, then you go to physics class and you study about the birth of the universe, and you study about astrophysics, let's say. Well, there are two different disciplines, of course. One is religion, mystical religion of Catholicism, St. Francis. The other one is astrophysics, science. Now, with astrophysics, you're not going to get anything spiritual. With St. Francis, you're not going to get astrophysics. But think about it. It's the same universe. St. Francis is talking about the universe. It's a projection from divinity. And God is present in that projection. And the physicist is talking about the physical universe. Well, they're not mutually exclusive. It's the same universe. It's just one is seen from the point of view of mystical religion, the other one is seen from the point of view of pure physics. It's the same universe. So that ability to see similarities in disparate things, as after a while you start putting the pieces together, you realize there may be all these different disciplines with all these different categories and subdisciplines and so on, but reality is one. So this vision of the whole that comes to the seer, and that's what they see the whole. That's called Sophia. That's called wisdom. Now there's another kind of wisdom. It's called practical wisdom. It's called phronesis, Phronesis. That's called practical wisdom. That is a little bit different. That has to do with seeing the whole situation and acting accordingly. And then there's speaking the whole truth too. When we speak on a subject, if you can speak in such a way that you say the whole truth, that you don't leave anything important out. Now, Plato's distinction between practical wisdom and speculative wisdom is almost negligible. In Aristotle, the philosopher we're going to study later, he'll make a big distinction between practical wisdom, which has to do with deliberation and seeing the whole truth of the whole situation, and acting in such a way, making a choice where that will lead to well-being. With Plato, this is an important point, and it's an important distinction between Plato and Aristotle. With Plato, having insight into the idea, the true idea, will automatically transform you such that you make the right decision. Like if you have an idea, if you have insight into the idea of education, and it's a true idea of education, then automatically you'll be able to recognize an educated person, and you'll be able to educate yourself properly because you'll see what education is. And it's very important that educators see what education is. Otherwise, we have sixth grade education of the average high school student in our country. Did you know that? The average high school student has a sixth grade level education. So that's not a good thing. So the educators need to have seen what is education. And, the same with all the ideas. So with Plato, if you have insight into the idea, then you're transformed by that insight and you'll be able to recognize it. The analogy sometimes I use is like gold and fool's gold. There's a certain mineral, it's called pyrite, and it's called fool's gold sometimes, and then there's gold. Now, you won't know the difference between fool's gold and real gold unless you've seen real gold, okay? And not just seen it with your eyes, but with your mind's eye also. And once you've seen gold, then you know the difference. Somebody can't sell you fool's gold. You won't be fooled by fool's gold. You'll know that's pyrite, this is gold. Gold has this deeper luster to it, and so on. So it's the same way with ideas. If you haven't seen the difference between a, an inadequate idea of something and an adequate idea of something, when somebody's speaking, you won't know the difference. Okay? You'll be duped. Because there's no way of knowing it. So the main thing is to gain insight into the idea, the true idea that corresponds to that word. That's what the whole thing about dialectic is all about. So in Plato's philosophy, there's really no distinction between Sophia and phronesis. The distinction comes in Aristotle. With Plato, if you want to be a courageous person, you have to find out what is courage. Once you find out what is courage, automatically you become courageous. If you want to be temperate, you have to find out what is temperance. Once you have insight into the idea of temperance, you'll become temperate. And the same with all the moral virtues. Now, with Aristotle, as we're going to see, insight into the idea is not going to be enough. You have to actually engage in the habit of being temperate, and then as time goes by, you become temperate, or as time goes by, you become courageous or just, and so on. The characteristics develop from corresponding activities and through your habits. But with Plato, there's emphasis on knowledge, insight into the ideas. And what's directing that knowledge is dialectic. What's driving that is this force of eros, this desire to procreate in beauty and to become immortal. So now we've reached the most beautiful. So wisdom is beautiful, okay? And we said we have these three kinds of wisdoms: speculative wisdom, that's Sophia; practical wisdom, but Plato never really distinguishes. The words, you gain practical wisdom through speculative wisdom. So those two you could sort of collapse. And then there's wisdom speaking. That's speaking the whole truth. It's just speculative wisdom, practical wisdom become articulate. Then you have wisdom speaking. By the way, they correspond to three parts of a human being. Speculative wisdom corresponds to the mind, the intellect. Then practical wisdom corresponds to our spirit. And then wisdom speaking corresponds to our capacity for language. And those are three things that distinguish humans from other animals. Other animals have mind and spirit and language, but ours is very different from theirs. But that's important about the practical wisdom and the speculative wisdom being collapsed in Plato. You gain practical wisdom through speculative wisdom. But for Aristotle, you don't gain practical wisdom through speculative wisdom. They're two different, they're related to each other, they help each other, but you don't gain practical wisdom by knowing something. In other words, you don't become courageous by knowing what is courage. You become courageous by acting courageously habitually, then you become a courageous person. It's like that with Aristotle, but not with Plato. So now we come to the pinnacle. Now, the other thing about this dialogue that makes it a wonderful dialogue is there's this description of absolute being, ultimate truth. And he calls it the idea of the good. Remember, he collapses the beautiful and the good. So love is the desire to procreate in beauty, perpetual possession of beauty, to participate in immortality. And the ultimate beauty, above wisdom even, is what he calls the idea of the good, absolute beauty. Now, absolute beauty, the way I see it, is being itself with a capital B. It would be what we would call, theologians would call God today, theos. But he decides not to call it God here. He calls it absolute beauty. And It's being, it's the ultimate, it's that beyond which there's nothing else, that one of which there is no other, no second. It's the ultimate. And he calls it absolute beauty. And this is the pinnacle, the goal of the transformation of Eros. This is what Eros is driving for. But look how it's gone, that trajectory. It's gone from just desiring, for sexual gratification to, seeing beauty as a whole, to beauty of the soul being above that even, and then the beauty of customs and laws and so on, then the beauty of knowledge, then the beauty of wisdom, now absolute beauty. And there's this description of absolute beauty, which sounds very close to the description of being that comes from a philosopher by the name of Parmenides, who was a pre-Socratic philosopher. He came before Socrates, and Plato had read, and Parmenides had a vision of being, absolute being with a capital B. And he describes it as uh, identical with itself. And he goes on and gives all the attributes of absolute being. And this is Plato's description of ultimate reality. So Eros is driving us towards reality. But reality for Plato is not just physical. It starts off physical, but then it becomes the spiritualization of sensuality. And then it becomes just purely idea. And so that's why Plato's philosophy is called idealism. So we need to allow Eros. So, in a nutshell, then, what Plato is saying is that we need to allow Eros to be our driving force, but we need to transform our Eros. This desire to procreate in beauty needs to be redirected towards higher and higher realities. So the Eros remains Eros. All the structure remains the same, but it goes through metamorphosis, goes through transformation, till finally to absolute beauty and to procreate there. And it's also a kind of beatific vision, too, that it's moving towards. By beatific, I mean there's a certain sense of ecstasy and joy that accompanies insight into higher and higher forms of reality. So Eros is driving us to reality. The good life means to become attuned to reality. Now, what happens next is there's probably more to that speech. I'm just trying to remember, the highlights of the speech. I reread the whole dialogue again. I've been teaching this dialogue for years, but I reread it again, and I just tried to recount what stuck in my rereading. But the next thing that happens, the way the dialogue ends, there's a man by the name of Alcibiades. The historical Alcibiades, there was a real man, his name was Alcibiades, and he was a traitor to the Athenians. When there was the Peloponnesian Wars were going on between Athens and Sparta. They lasted like 23 years or 27 years, something like that. And Alcibiades was like a traitor to the Spartans against the, but we don't hear about that in this. And the other thing about Alcibiades is he was very political, but and he was very handsome. They say that he was known for his good looks, and he was in love with Socrates, who was ugly. Okay, so that means he must have seen something in Socrates beyond the physical. And so he comes crashing the party, and he's drunk, and he's got this wreath of ivy that he's going to he wants to place on Agathon's head because he heard that Agathon won the prize for writing the best tragedy. And he comes and they hear this drunken revelry outside. They let him in, and he comes with his friends, and they crash the party basically. And Phaedrus, or it's Agathon, somebody says, if you're going, I think it's Phaedrus who he says, if you're going to stay here at the party, you're welcome to come. But if you come, you need to engage in what we've been doing here. We've been giving speeches in praise of Eros. And now, if you want to stay, you're going to have to give a speech in praise of Eros. Well, Alcibiades says, well, that I can't do, but Oh, then he looks at and there's Socrates, and he's drunk, so he sits down and he doesn't even know it's Socrates, and then he looks and it's Socrates, and there's things that are being said that you can sort of find your way to Plato's philosophy by this bantering going on. I'm not mentioning everything in the dialogue; we'd be here all semester, right? But okay, but then so Alcibiades says, "Well, okay, I can do it, but I'm not going to speak about Eros. I'm going to speak about Socrates." So now Alcibiades gives a speech on Socrates, and you learn about Socrates. That's important for our purposes because see, Plato is setting up Socrates as the archetype philosopher, and he's going to say, if you want to live a good life, you need the good life, you need to live philosophically. Well, the next question in anybody's mind is, what does it mean to live philosophically? Does that mean I have to major in philosophy, or can I, well, emulate Socrates, be like him. You don't have to imitate him and go around barefooted like he did, but live like he lived. Okay, how did he live? He lived questioningly. He questioned. He engaged in dialectic. He sublimated his eros. So you have Alcibiades giving this speech of Socrates. So we get to know a little bit more about Socrates by listening to Alcibiades' speech on Socrates. Now, let's get into that a little bit more. When he speaks about Socrates, he doesn't just tell about his character, but he focuses on his erotic side. And that's exactly what the dialogue is all about, right? It's all about eros. He speaks about Socrates' eros. And so he tells a story, a sexy little story, that they were trapped together one night, maybe in the mountains or somewhere. I can't remember, the snow or something. They couldn't go anywhere. And they were trapped alone in this cabin or this dwelling. Not a cabin. They didn't have cabins then. We have log cabins now. But in the dwelling. And Alcibiades confesses to everyone there that he made every attempt for physical connection with Socrates that he could to seduce Socrates physically, and everyone failed. Okay, and that Socrates took the erotic drives and redirected it towards philosophy. They philosophized all night, basically. Okay. Um, so what that tells me, I mean, there's much more to the story than that, but what that tells me is what. So if Plato were here and you were to ask him, why did you have Alcibiades? I mean, you could have written this dialogue any way you wanted to, right? And he's not trying to be historically accurate. Probably none of this happened. Probably the only thing that happened was there was a party and they got together at Agathon's home and some speeches were given. And that was it. And there was talk about what speeches were all about. And maybe some of this got into Plato's head, but the artist Plato made this dialogue. So he made the whole thing up based on some elements of truth, probably. So he didn't have to have Alcibiades come in there, but he did. So if we were to ask Plato, why did you have Alcibiades come in there and give that speech? Well, think about it. Everything Socrates said about Eros, we learn from another source, from Alcibiades, that he actually practiced what he preached. So he lived it. He wasn't just, that's an important point, actually. He lived it. He didn't just think about it. Some people know a lot, but they can't act upon it. And we have two powers we have the intellect and the will. Sometimes the intellect knows, but the will is too weak to do it, right? You know, it takes willpower. So he's showing that Socrates' resolve and his will was just as strong as his intellect. There's another thing I left out that's part of Plato's notion of love that I should mention before I end this is along the way, since dialectic is a very important part of eros. In fact, eros is the driving force of dialectic, and the soul then ascends. So you have the driving force, the directing force, and the soul is ascending. What's happening among the people who come together who are in love, They help each other become better persons. That's an important part of Plato's theory of love. Okay, it's not just having sex, but we become the occasion for other people becoming better persons. It's not like a counselor trying to help someone else, or it's not so it's not like that. It's just two people coming together, and they're attracted to each other, but they're attracted to each other's souls as well as the body, and they help each other to ascend, to evolve into higher and higher forms. Um, that's important. And then I just want to say this before I end this. Have you ever heard someone say, "Oh, I'm having a platonic. It's my relationship with so and so is purely platonic." Somebody may say, I heard you to their girlfriend or their boyfriend. I heard you left Alice's house like 3 in the morning. Somebody said, so what were you doing there like 3 in the morning? Oh, Alice is my friend. She's our relationship is purely platonic. You've heard people talk like that. So why did they mention Plato's name there? I mean, why don't they say my relationship was Leonardo da Vinci or Einsteinian? They mentioned Plato. Well, the reason why is because of what we're talking about. Plato's very rich and deep concept of eros, eros sublimated into friendship, into what we call friendship. But most people don't know about what we're talking about now because they haven't taken the time to study Plato. So all that's left of that is that it's friendship. We're not having sex. Basically, in that little dialogue that I shared with you about the the jealous person, um, he's saying, we're friends only. We don't. Our relationship is friendship. It's not romantic. We're not having sex. But underneath that is this rich and deep concept of spiritualization of eros, and that's why the only thing left among people, is when people say, well, we're having a platonic relationship, but they don't know the rich and deep concept of platonic love that's in Plato's philosophy. This is only one dialogue. It comes out in other dialogues as well, but among all the dialogues, this one focuses most explicitly on eros. Okay, so this is a unorthodox approach to Plato's moral philosophy. If we were to have more time, we would go through all the early dialogues, one on courage, one on temperance, one on and Socrates is trying to gain insight into these moral excellences, and he believes that if you could gain insight into that, then that excellence would become yours. But this dialogue is talking more about the driving force that leads one upward, and what's the dynamics that are taking place among people who are in love and allow eros to become sublimated into finally, insight into the ultimate. Okay, so those are 3 talks on the Symposium, trying to extract the moral philosophy, Plato's moral philosophy, from one dialogue called the Symposium. Thanks.